According to the calendar, voters are set to go to the polls this October. Elections are difficult enough to organize, not to mention during a pandemic. To help deliver a safe vote this fall, Election Saskatchewan is asking the provincial government for help. Adam Hunter joins me now with some of the details. Adam, what is Election Saskatchewan asking for?
Well, the Chief Electoral Officer for Saskatchewan, Michael Boda, sent a letter to the Premier yesterday. He's asking for a few things, and he says he needs them in a matter of days, not weeks, in order to successfully and safely put on the election in October. He says he's working with October as a mandate as the Premier. It's up to him when to call the election. He could call it earlier. He's already ruled that out this spring. But Boda says there's a few things the government needs to do for Election Saskatchewan. One is increase the number of schools that the election and voting can be made in. He says right now they can't physically distance safely with the number of schools they have. He'll also be asking the government to close schools on October 26th, Election Day. Another thing he's asking for is help with procurement. So getting the right amount of PPE for the workers in those polling stations. He says he can't do it on his own. It's something that Election Saskatchewan has experience in, is getting paper, but not PPE. A couple other things they're asking for is a slight change in legislation, which would offer Boda a little bit more flexibility and powers to adjust things that would be needed for the election just to deal with the dynamic changing situation of COVID-19. For example, allowing him to bring in more mail-in ballots. Now, people are saying, why don't we just vote by mail-in? Not so easy. He says in order to do a widespread mail-in ballot, he would need 12 months to prepare. About 1% of voters last time around in Saskatchewan did a mail-in ballot. So very few, they don't have capacity. He wants to ramp that up, but he'll need help from the government to make that change. Finally, he wants to set up an advisory committee with the Premier, the House leaders from the government and opposition, and Dr. Saqib Shahab to make the best decision and come up with some advice on how to run the election safely and in a timely manner.
Adam, what are some challenges to holding an election given the current situation?
Well, Sam, the first thing that comes to mind is getting enough volunteers and workers for Election Day. Given that the average age, Boda tells me, of a worker on Election Day is over 60. So we know that COVID-19 presents some extra risks for people in that age group. So he said making sure that they're safe, that they feel safe is going to be one of the things that they're going to need to address. Another thing is just securing those spaces, like I mentioned, getting the amount of schools. He said they're going to have to be in gymnasiums. Election Day, the schools will need to be closed. And on the advanced polling days, they don't want the schools to close, but they'll need exclusive access to the gymnasiums. A few of the things Boda told me in his experience of more than 25 years of putting on elections around the world, he says he's never had to deal with something like a pandemic. That's why he says it's so important to get widespread consultation and also cooperation from the government in order to make sure that they're making the right calls with, of course, the advice of the Chief Medical Health Officer guiding them along the ways. And he said that these things need to be put in motion now. He said he could run a traditional election almost immediately, but this won't be a traditional election. So they need a few more things to be put into place in order to plan and make sure that people can safely vote, whether it's advanced polls or on voting day, and knowing that there won't be this huge increase in mail-in ballots, because he says that's just not realistic for this upcoming election.
He has a lot of asks, Adam. What has the province said?
Well, the government gave us a statement today through the House Leader, Jeremy Harrison. He said that the government's received the recommendations from Mr. Boda, that they'll work with him on those recommendations. And we'll have to wait and see over the next number of days and even into next week whether the government's going to work together. One of the things that Mr. Boda is asking for is for some legislative changes. We know that the government has no plans to recall the legislature at this time. So a little bit interesting and tricky to see how they would pass some legislative changes to give him extra powers if they aren't going to be in the Assembly anytime soon.
Thanks so much for this, Adam.
You're welcome.
The CBC's Adam Hunter in Regina tonight.